Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, absent-mindedly washing dishes as the afternoon sun streamed through the window. The rhythmic sound of water splashing and dishes clinking was a comforting background noise in the small, cozy house she shared with her husband, James. James sat at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing the Braille labels on his favorite books. Blind since birth, James navigated the world with a quiet grace that never failed to inspire Sarah. Despite his disability, James had never let his lack of sight hold him back. He had built a successful career as a music teacher, and his passion for life was infectious. As Sarah dried her hands on a dish towel, she glanced over at James, a pang of guilt tugging at her heart. Lately she had been feeling restless, trapped in the monotony of their routine. She loved James deeply, but there was a part of her that longed for excitement, for something more. Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting Sarah's thoughts. Curious, she wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the front door. Standing on the doorstep was a man she had never seen before, tall and handsome with a disarming smile. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. The man extended his hand. "I'm Mark," he said. "I just moved in next door. I thought I'd come over and introduce myself." Sarah hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand reluctantly. "I'm Sarah," she replied, forcing a polite smile. As Mark chatted animatedly about his new job and his plans for the neighborhood, Sarah found herself drawn to his charm and confidence. It had been so long since she had felt a connection with anyone outside of her marriage, and Mark's attention was like a breath of fresh air. Unbeknownst to Sarah, this chance encounter would set into motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. In the days that followed Mark's introduction, Sarah found herself thinking about him more and more. His easy smile and effortless charisma lingered in her mind, casting a shadow over her once contented life with James. As she went about her daily routine, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness that had settled in her chest. She found herself seeking out excuses to run into Mark, relishing the stolen moments they shared, exchanging pleasantries over the fence or during chance encounters in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, James sensed a subtle shift in Sarah's demeanor. Though he couldn't see the world around him, he could feel the tension in the air, the distance that had grown between them. His instincts told him that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the dimly lit living room, her mind filled with thoughts of Mark, she realized with a start just how much she craved his attention. The realization sent a wave of guilt crashing over her, but she couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through her veins at the thought of him. Unable to resist the temptation any longer, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed Mark's number, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for him to answer. "Hello," Mark's voice sounded on the other end of the line, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. "Hi, it's Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wondering if you wanted to grab a cup of coffee sometime." A smile tugged at the corners of Mark's lips. "I'd love to," he replied. "How about tomorrow afternoon?" Sarah's heart fluttered with excitement as she agreed to meet him, her mind already racing with possibilities. In that moment, she pushed aside the guilt and doubt that gnawed at her conscience, giving in to the intoxicating pull of temptation. Sarah's rendezvous with Mark for coffee turned into a regular occurrence. They met in secret, stealing moments away from the prying eyes of their neighbors and friends. With each meeting, Sarah felt herself drawn deeper into the web of deceit she had woven. Their conversations were filled with laughter and shared confidences, and Sarah found herself opening up to Mark in ways she never had with James. She reveled in the attention he showered upon her, basking in the glow of his admiration. Meanwhile, James's suspicions grew with each passing day. Though he couldn't see the world around him, he could sense the change in Sarah's demeanor, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but he couldn't bring himself to shatter the fragile illusion of their marriage. One evening, as Sarah returned home from another secret meeting with Mark, she found James sitting alone in the living room, a somber expression on his face. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized that he had somehow discovered her betrayal. "Sarah," James said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "We need to talk." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she sank into a chair opposite him, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to deny everything, to pretend that she hadn't been sneaking around behind his back, but the truth was written in the lines of his face, in the way his shoulders slumped with defeat. With a heavy heart, Sarah confessed everything to James, her words pouring out in a rush of guilt and remorse. She watched as the hurt and betrayal flickered across his face, tears glistening in his sightless eyes. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just so lost, so lonely." But James shook his head, his expression filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. "It doesn't matter," he said quietly. "What's done is done." In that moment, Sarah realized the magnitude of her betrayal, the irreparable damage she had caused to the man she loved more than life itself. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she reached out to James, desperate for forgiveness, for a chance to make things right. But as she took his hand in hers, she knew that some wounds ran too deep to ever fully heal, and as James pulled away, his trust shattered beyond repair, Sarah realized that she had lost more than just her husband. She had lost herself in the darkness of her own deception. The days that followed Sarah's confession were filled with an oppressive silence that hung heavy in the air. James retreated into himself, his once vibrant spirit dulled by the pain of Sarah's betrayal. Meanwhile, Sarah was consumed by a sense of guilt and regret that threatened to suffocate her. Despite their best efforts to maintain a facade of normalcy, the cracks in their marriage were impossible to ignore. Their conversations were strained, their touches devoid of the warmth and affection they once shared. And though James never mentioned Mark by name, Sarah could feel his silent accusation hanging between them like a dark cloud. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the living room, the weight of her guilt pressing down upon her, she heard James's voice from the kitchen. His words were low and muffled, but she could sense the urgency in his tone. Curiosity piqued, she made her way to the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. As she entered the room, she found James sitting at the kitchen table, a look of determination etched on his face. In front of him lay a stack of papers, their contents hidden from view. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what they were: phone records, detailing her calls and messages to Mark. "I found these," James said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "I wanted to believe that it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid, but the truth was right in front of me all along." Sarah's heart sank as she watched James sift through the papers, his fingers tracing the lines of her betrayal. She wanted to reach out to him, to beg for his forgiveness, but she knew that words alone could never undo the damage she had caused. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you." But James merely shook his head, his gaze distant as he stared off into the distance. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," he said softly. "You've shattered everything we had together, and I don't know if it's possible to put the pieces back together." With tears streaming down her cheeks, Sarah reached out to James, desperate for some sign of forgiveness, some glimmer of hope that they could overcome this obstacle together. But as he pulled away from her touch, his eyes filled with pain and disappointment, she knew that their marriage was hanging by a thread, teetering on the brink of collapse. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah and James sat across from each other in the dimly lit kitchen. Sarah's heart felt heavy with regret as she watched James sift through the evidence of her betrayal, his expression a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "I trusted you," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought we had something special, something that could withstand anything. But you threw it all away for what? A fleeting moment of excitement." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion as she struggled to find the words to explain herself. She wanted to tell James that it wasn't just about the thrill of the affair, that she had been searching for something more, something that had been missing from their marriage for far too long. But she knew that no excuse could ever justify her actions, no explanation could ever erase the pain she had caused. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own tears. "I never meant to hurt you. I was just so lost, so lonely." But James shook his head, his eyes filled with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite place. "It doesn't matter," he said quietly. "What's done is done." With a heavy heart, Sarah reached out to James, desperate for some sign of forgiveness, some glimmer of hope that they could find a way to move past this. But as he pulled away from her touch, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut her to the core. She realized that their marriage was hanging by a thread, teetering on the brink of collapse. As Sarah watched James retreat into himself, his once vibrant spirit dulled by the pain of her betrayal, she knew that she had lost more than just her husband. She had lost herself in the darkness of her own deception. And as she sat alone in the empty kitchen, the weight of her guilt pressing down upon her like a suffocating blanket, she realized that she had to find a way to make amends, to rebuild the trust that she had so callously destroyed. But whether James would ever be able to forgive her, whether their marriage could ever be salvaged, remained to be seen. In the days that followed the confrontation, Sarah found herself consumed by a sense of despair unlike anything she had ever experienced before. The weight of her guilt pressed down upon her like a suffocating blanket, leaving her feeling lost and alone in a world that had been shattered by her own actions. Despite her overwhelming remorse, Sarah refused to give up hope. She knew that she had to find a way to make amends, to prove to James that she was worthy of his forgiveness. With a newfound determination, she set out on a journey of self-discovery, determined to rebuild the trust that she had so callously destroyed. Slowly but surely, Sarah began to take responsibility for her actions. She sought therapy to address the underlying issues that had led her to betray James, confronting the demons that had long haunted her from the shadows. With each session, she peeled back the layers of her own insecurities, gaining a deeper understanding of the person she had become. Meanwhile, James struggled to come to terms with the betrayal that had torn their marriage apart. Though he still loved Sarah with all his heart, he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that lingered like a specter in the back of his mind. He wanted to forgive her, to believe that they could overcome this obstacle together, but he feared that the damage had been done, that their love had been irreparably tainted by her betrayal. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah and James embarked on a journey of healing together, each step bringing them closer to redemption. They sought couples therapy to address the wounds that had festered between them, learning to communicate openly and honestly in a way they never had before. Slowly but surely, the walls that had once divided them began to crumble, replaced by a newfound sense of understanding and compassion. And as they worked through their issues together, they discovered that their love was stronger than they had ever imagined, capable of withstanding even the darkest of storms. In the end, Sarah and James emerged from their ordeal stronger and more united than ever before. Though the scars of betrayal would always linger, they knew that they had overcome the greatest challenge of their marriage, emerging on the other side with a renewed sense of purpose and commitment. As they stood hand in hand, facing the future together, Sarah knew that she had finally found the redemption she had been searching for, and that no matter what obstacles lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that could withstand anything. Sarah and James stood together in the warm glow of the sunset, their fingers intertwined as they watched the world pass by. It had been a long and arduous journey, filled with pain and heartache, but they had emerged on the other side stronger and more united than ever before. As they looked back on the trials and tribulations they had faced, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the lessons they had learned along the way. Their marriage had been tested in ways she had never imagined possible, but through it all, their love had remained steadfast and true. Together they had confronted their demons, laid bare the scars of their past, and emerged on the other side with a newfound sense of clarity and purpose. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew that as long as they had each other, they could weather any storm that came their way. With a renewed sense of hope and determination, Sarah and James turned their gaze toward the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For in each other's arms they had found the strength to overcome even the darkest of nights, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And as they walked hand in hand into the unknown, Sarah knew that no matter what obstacles they may face, their love would always be their guiding light, illuminating the path forward and leading them toward a future filled with endless possibilities.
There are a lot of lessons to be learned from this story. I would love to hear your opinion in comment section. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to like, share, and press the red button to subscribe to my channel. Bye.